Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do. Pushing and a pulling in the great big harbor, in the great big world is so much fun. So many brand new things to discover. Waking with the sun, gotta get the job done. Oh, Theodore and Emily, Bodak, Hank and George, and the harbor master too.
Theodore and George were finished work for the day. Now they could do whatever they wanted. "What do you want to do, George?" asked Theodore. "Tug of war," boomed George right away.
Oh, so this is just a normal everyday activity you do after work? Guess there's really nothing else to do other than a good old-fashioned game of tug-of-war, I suppose. Then again, these are tugboats that are very limited to do so much in terms of play. Whatever floats your boat, I guess.
Shut up.
So Theodore and George tied their tow ropes together, and the two began their tug-of-war game.
"Bet you can't pull me past Bedford," blasted George, vrooming his powerful engine. "Bet I can too," thundered Theodore above the roar of his engine. Theodore grunted and groaned. George boomed and vroomed. Bedford dinged his bell again as George pulled Theodore past him.
Well, I guess that does kind of look like fun. For a tugboat, at least. Surprised they didn't blow their engines from pulling that hard. And it's also no surprise that George would win at this particular game. Wonder if Theodore's actually won. But he may not care for all we know. Well, just as the two were finishing up, Emily hurried over looking to play.
"Hi, Emily," huffed Theodore, all out of breath. "Can I try?" asked Emily. "No, you can't," said George. "Why not?" asked Emily. "Because you're a girl tug," said George. "Girl tugs can't do tug-of-war." Well, when Emily heard this, her engine suddenly felt like it was boiling. She just floated off without another word. "But Emily's our friend," said Theodore. "Girl tugs can't do tug-of-war," George said again. Theodore, he didn't say anything else. But inside, what George had said just didn't feel right.
Yeah, that doesn't sound right. The hell is with the sexist comment, George? How dare you even make a statement like that? Who said girls weren't good at something simple like tug-of-war? And how would you know if you've never even asked Emily? You know, this is the kind of comment that James would make. Oh, wait.
Sodor rescue engines are steam engines. You are a steam tram. Steam trams can't be rescue engines.
I'm sensing a connection here, and I don't like it. So the following morning, the dispatcher assigned Emily to work with George, but she quickly backed out as she was still angry with him. Can't say that I blame her.
"Excuse me, sir, but could Theodore work with George instead?" "Well," said the dispatcher, "the ship has a very big load today. It might be tough tugging." Now George floated forward. "Oh, we can move that ship without Emily," he boomed in his biggest voice. And then he vroomed his engine as if that proved it. "Very well," said the dispatcher.
Well, look at you, Mr. Big and Proud. Seriously, George, you need to take that big ego of yours and drop it, like, way down. The fact that he doesn't even feel guilty for what he said is pretty appalling. Again, I really don't blame Emily for still being angry, even after George revs his engine and blows smoke in her face, as if to really think that proves anything. Think those testosterone levels got to your head there, Georgie? So, being that she had no work, Emily decided she'd go and talk to Constance.
"Emily," said Constance in a softer voice, "you're being very quiet. Is something the matter? I was supposed to work with George today, answered Emily. But, well, he thinks girl tugs aren't as good as boy tugs. That's nonsense, huffed Constance. I know that, replied Emily, but George doesn't. Just thinking about George made Emily angry. I'm never going to work with George again, she said. Never's a long time, said Constance. We all have to live together in the harbor. Well, said Emily, maybe if George said he was sorry. But Emily knew George would never say he was sorry. That just wasn't like George.
Then again, don't you remember the other fight you two were in a season back? Both tugs practically bickered like an old married couple, and now they're doing it again, but for a completely different reason. But if you all remember, George did apologize in the end. So why wouldn't he do it here? That would be saying that George never apologizes for the stuff he says and or does. That's kind of an ass-backwards thought there, Emily. Just saying. Anyways, around the same time, George and Theodore arrived to bring in the ship. However, as they buttoned on, they found it just a bit difficult to get her going.
Let's go, repeated George. I am going, replied Theodore. But the ship isn't. I'm carrying a double load today, called Catherine proudly. Theodore made his toughest tugging face, and with a big pull from George, the great ship slowly began to move. See? Shouted George. We don't need Emily.
Oh, sure. You say that now. Just wait and see what happens in a few seconds there, Georgie boy. You're gonna eat your own words, my friend. I'm telling you, those testy levels are really screwing with his brain, I swear. I just feel bad that Theodore is once again trapped in the middle, and by the way, hasn't even said hardly anything about the situation. Maybe he's just trying to stay out of it. Who knows? Hell, that might even be the smart thing to do. Anyways, as the two tugs went to turn around Willie's Island, Catherine's container shifted, which caused everyone to float crooked. And to make matters worse, they were heading straight towards Owen.
Stop! Theodore cried to George. Stop! George took a mighty breath and tugged hard against his tow rope to try and stop the heavy ship. But it was no use. In another moment, they would all go crashing right into the giant oil rig. We need help, shouted Theodore. If I can't stop this ship, roared George, no one can. George pulled against that ship until it felt like his tow rope was going to snap. But it was still no use. I'm just not strong enough, he cried at last. For the first time he could ever remember, George the Valiant was ready to give up.
Yeah, who's the mighty tug on the Harbour campus now? Told you eat your own words, George. While I do get this is a perilous situation, I can't help but laugh at the fact that Owen just looks so calm and he sees this giant container ship coming straight towards him. Does no one else find this funny but me? However, all joking aside, for a moment it did look like they were all going to crash. So George blasted his whistle looking for help, and who showed up not a moment sooner but Emily.
Emily came smoking around the bend of Willie's Island. She turned straight into the path of Catherine the container ship. Emily butted her bumpers against her and began to push. Push with all her might. Just seeing Emily seemed to make Theodore and George's tiredness disappear. They felt strong again. And together, George the Valiant, Theodore Tugboat, and Emily the Vigorous stopped Catherine the container ship right in front of Owen.
Whew. The fact that they just missed hitting Owen by inches is crazy. Although I can't tell if it's just me, but why does it look like in some shots they get closer and then further back? Am I the only one who notices this? You'd think by now they would have crashed into Owen, but thankfully no one did, so that's a plus. So after they docked the ship, George was ready for another tug of war. He even said something rather surprising to Emily.
Emily, he announced in his biggest voice, do you want to do tug of war with us? I thought it was just for boy tugs, replied Emily. Theodore knew George was having trouble saying the words he'd been thinking of, so he floated over and gave him a gentle nudge. Emily, said George a little quieter, I'm sorry I was mean to you before. It doesn't matter if you're a girl tug or a boy tug. You're my friend. You're my friend too, George.
Truer words have never been spoken. Then again, none of this would have happened had George kept that big mouth of his shut. Emily may be the only girl tug in the harbor, but she doesn't have anything to prove because of her gender. She's just as useful as everyone else. Didn't think about that, did you, George? You know, I think there's a bigger lesson here. Shut up and think before you speak. Anyways, now that everything is all hunky-dory and everybody's friends again, time for some tug-of-war.
1, 2, 3, go! Theodore and George and Emily laughed and tooted their whistles together. Tug-of-war was just about the most fun 3 friends could have.
And that concludes Emily and the Tug-of-War. This is probably one of the most important topics for a kids show to handle. We don't get to see this in a lot of other shows nowadays, and truthfully, this was handled really well. Nobody should ever have to feel discriminated from activities because of their gender, race, sexuality, whatever the case may be. I really sympathize with Emily here, as I too have been excluded from activities back in my younger days, as I'm sure there are many of us that have dealt with this problem too. It is quite shocking that George of all characters had to be taught this lesson. Normally when he and Emily butt heads, it's mostly due to their egos. This time, George took a personal jab and made a simple little tug-of-war game all about a tug's sex. Apparently that message didn't sink in thoroughly from their last big argument. What are we going to do with you, George? Thankfully, though, I will say, it's a good damn thing he learned his lesson. Music was pretty decent for the most part. There were some ditties between the tug-of-war games, some soft tracks for those tender moments, and the incidental music when the tugs were out of control. And there's really nothing to brag about with the visuals, as it's just mostly the same locations we're already aware of. Overall, I think this is one of Season 3's best episodes. I personally recommend it for everyone to check out. Just do yourselves a favor, and don't be a George! Up next is Theodore and the Lost Bell Buoy.